Hi, my name is Rex Picket, and I'm the author of Sideways, the movie that probably a lot of you know. And I've just written the sequel, which is called Vertical. I brought that here, which has just come out. And it's 7 years later. I'll give you a little quick plot thing in case some of you are going to write some other questions in. And 7 years later, Miles is now a successful author. And Jack is divorced and on the skids and has a kid. Miles's mother's had a stroke, and she's living in assisted living in San Diego. So Miles gets, she wants to be with her sister in Wisconsin. So when Miles gets offered to be a master of ceremonies at the International Pinot Noir celebration in the Great Willamette Valley of Oregon, he hatches this harebrained plan. He leases a handicap ramp van, piles in his wheelchair-dependent mother, Jack, 12 cases of wine, a pot-smoking Filipina nursemaid, and a little Yorkie Terrier, and they all head off for Oregon en route to Wisconsin. They don't all make it. So anyway, that's the plot of Vertical. I hope you read it. I'm going to answer your questions, which are probably mostly going to be about Sideways, but we'll see. Going in between glasses here. So Joey writes, other than being an author, what's your next greatest passion in life, or is that the only thing top on your list? It's a good question. I mean, I've said, you know, a lot of writers have asked me what it takes to make it as a writer, make it as a filmmaker or whatever. And I really think it has to be at the top of your list. I mean, sure, I have other passions. I play golf occasionally. I used to fall into that. But I find that I have to put everything into what I'm doing and not... And I find if I meet somebody and they're saying, oh, I'm just writing scripts and I'm also doing this or whatever, I almost for sure know they're not going to make it. So really the greatest passion of my life is writing, was filmmaking. I made 2 independent feature films in the 80s. Both were sold, but the second one, which was released, didn't do well at the box office, so I went back to writing. But it is an all-consuming passion for me, and I really, everything is secondary to me. Relationships, pets, anything is just secondary. So I can't honestly say I have any other passion than film, which is my main passion. When people have asked me about writing and writing books, and I say I don't write books to win Pulitzers. I write books to be made into movies because I really have written more screenplays, 20, 25, 30 screenplays. I've also made 2 independent feature films. So my real passion is film and literature, and writing is right at the top of the list. Thanks, Joey. This is from Richard. In the film, Miles reveals to Maya his book name the day after yesterday. Is there any significance of this title to you? Richard, that is not the name of the book in the novel. The screenplay was adapted by the director Alexander Payne and his writing partner Jim Taylor, and they were playing a little bit on, you know, in that scene when Miles speaks so eloquently about wine, but when he talks about himself and when he talks about his work, he's incredibly awkward. It's a little bit different in the novel. So obviously the day after yesterday is this a kind of an oxymoronic or paradoxical title, obviously, because the day after yesterday is today, which is what Maya points out. So they were playing on the fact that he was confused about himself and he was unself-aware. But when suddenly when he starts talking about wine, boy, he's just, you know, he blossoms. So it's kind of like a little in-joke there about Miles, but it's not in the novel. Miles is a little bit different in the novel, and we'll probably come to this in another question, and so is Jack. And in fact, I just wrote the play of Sideways, and it's based on the novel, and it's going to be at the Ruskin Group Theater here in Santa Monica, premiering in December, and you'll see that the characters are a little bit different. Miles in the movie is a little bit more... In the movie, we laugh at Miles, but we don't really laugh at anything he says. In the book, Miles is actually a pretty funny guy. You actually laugh at him. I'd like to feel the book was written in first person from the standpoint of Miles, so I guess in many ways I'm Miles. And so is Vertical was written first person from the standpoint of Miles. And Jack is a little broader. He's not quite the dim bulb he is in the movie. In the novel, he's a little more generous of character, but it's still a very faithful adaptation. Anyway, thanks for the question. Rachel, what was the best part of researching a book that has a lot to do with wine? Where did your fascination, inspiration for that aspect of it come from? Well, the San Ynez Valley where it all takes place is about 2.5 hours north of Los Angeles. And I, in the early 90s, was going through a divorce, going through a tough time. My second indie feature, released by Island Pictures, called From Hollywood to Deadwood, completely bombed, and I was nowhere. And I kind of got back into golf because it was very relaxing to me, and playing golf in LA is a drag. So I started going north to Santa Barbara, oddly enough, because the courses are more uncrowded. And people kept saying, you got to go to this course called La Próxima, you got to go. So finally I went another 50 miles over the hill, as we say. You literally go over a hill. This beautiful place, the San Ynez Valley, that now is everybody knows about because of the movie, which is the setting for the movie. So I really went up there to play golf, and then I started staying overnight at the Windmill Inn, just like Miles and Jack, $29.95. And then I had to have a place to eat, so I walked to the closest place. It was the Hitching Post, which is now an iconic restaurant. So I really started to go up there to play golf initially, and then I found out I was in wine country, because if you drive up the 101, for those of you who know California, it sort of parallels the Interstate 5, and if you go by 2 exits, you've gone by that entire area that is where they shot Sideways. And I stopped there, and it was very uncrowded, it was very beautiful, it was very relaxing, initially to play golf, and then I got into wine. And so really the inspiration for it, there wasn't really any one thing that inspired it. I mean, the 90s was a very tough time for me, and in the mid-90s I wrote a mystery novel, and it didn't get published, so thus Miles, who couldn't get a novel published, and he has like 70 rejection letters, as I had, and I was kind of clinging to the hope that I would be a mystery writer, and since my film career didn't work out. And then, you know, other things are happening. So I really poured in, when I wrote Sideways, I poured in everything in the kitchen sink. I poured in the divorce. That's one of the main leitmotifs of Sideways, which is that Miles is going through, he feels remorseful about his marriage and whatever, and he's having trouble moving on and whatever. He can't get his novel published. The one difference is in the novel, Miles is actually, like me, he was an out-of-work screenwriter living on the edge. In the movie, they made him an 8th grade school teacher, but other than that, they kept it pretty similar. So really the inspiration was all my frustration with my writing career, my film career, everything was just poured into that moment, and maybe we'll come back to some of the other things that inspired it. But that's a great question. I could probably go on for an hour on that one. This question is from Kaz. Is there anything you can mention about the possibility of this becoming a film? Well, that's a great question. There are a lot of Sideways was such a much beloved movie. I get it every day. I mean, almost every day from somebody. They don't really make sophisticated R-rated comedies like that anymore. Trust me, there are a lot of people who would like this to be a movie. There's a lot of money on the table. I've actually already done the screenplay adaptation at the behest of the producer myself this time. But it comes down to the director, Alexander Payne, and Fox Searchlight owns the film rights. Fox Searchlight did Sideways. They own the film rights to Miles and Jack in perpetuity whenever I write any Miles and Jack character. So I don't really have any control over it. They would wait, because the film was so successful, they would wait on Alexander Payne. And bear in mind, it also would be dependent on Paul Giamatti as well, whether they wanted to do it. And Alexander has made another film, and he's announced that he's going to do yet another film. That isn't to say it couldn't be done with another director. So there's a lot of things happening, but the main thing is I think there's a lot of pressure, because Vertical is not like The Hangover, where it's just a retread of the original movie. I mean, it really takes these characters. I mean, somebody once said, and I don't want to sound pompous here, that it was almost like Godfather 2 to Godfather 1, albeit totally different genre, you know, comedy, dramedy, or whatever you want to call it. But it really takes the characters to another level. Vertical does that. It's so I don't think it's like it's going to come down to Alexander Payne. It's going to come down to him either giving his blessing and saying to Fox Searchlight, you can go ahead and do this with another director, which might be a hard thing for him to say, because he feels kind of proprietary toward the material. It was his own baby. He lived with it for 2 or 3 years. He may not want to revisit those characters. There's a lot of things going on. The book just came out 3 months. I just finished a script 2 months ago. There's a lot on the table. But trust me, the people at Fox Searchlight, they would love to see this happen, because everybody knows there's probably $250 million on the table in total gross for a film like this. I mean, the built-in audience is so huge. So it's kind of scary from a director's standpoint, because on one hand, what if you go and do it and you fail? On the other hand, you know, if you succeed, are you going to be criticized by your peers for having gone back to the well? I think these are things going through, you know, Alexander Payne's mind, and Fox Searchlight won't move without his blessing, and Alexander will only do it if he feels like he wants to do it, and so we'll see, you know, to be continued on that one. Typhoid Annie, what kind of involvement did you have in the making of the movie adaptation? Really good question, Typhoon or Typhoid. You know, often the novelist is, once you sign a contract and you option your novel, and then ultimately it goes into development and then becomes a movie, they will push you aside. They don't have to involve you unless you're somebody like J.K. Rowling or John Grisham. They would contractually have it that they can probably approve the screenwriter, approve the screenplay. I didn't have that kind of power. I didn't even have close to just, please, just give me some option money, or please, just make the damn movie. But Alexander was he understood that this was a very personal novel. He knows a lot about wine, and his writing partner, Jim Taylor, as well. So they gave me every draft of the script, every single draft of it, and they were interested in my input to drafts. Not that they were going to use it, but they were interested in my input. And I'd say the little input I had was, there's a famous, what I call the wine duologue between Miles and Maya. And for the first two drafts of the script, Miles spoke very eloquently about Pinot outside on that porch at night, but Maya's speech didn't exist. And I think after the second draft, I just wrote a note in the margin, wouldn't it be wonderful if Maya had a complimentary speech about wine? And in the third draft came this long, beautiful speech that in acting classes is used over and over and over again. So I didn't write the speech, but I may have spawned it. I don't really know. I've never really asked Alexander that specifically. And the ending was actually Miles. If you remember, Miles hears Maya leaving a message on his answering machine, and then he goes up and knocks on her door. We don't know what's going to happen. That drive up to San Ynez was not in any of the drafts, of the first three drafts of the script, and the ending was just him listening to her voice on the answering machine, and it just went to black. And I think I wrote a note in the margin saying, this is neither fish nor fowl as an ending for me. And the book, the ending was a little bit different. Maya actually shows up at the wedding. He asked her, and she shows up. And although it's not like some happy ending, Alexander said, well, it's a little too Hollywood for me. So, so he kind of met it halfway. So I would say that was really my only involvement. I did take a couple of trips up to the setting with Alexander and Jim Taylor. And I mean, I think we took at least 3 trips, and I showed him a lot of the places. But they pretty much shot the first draft of the screenplay. They tinkered with it very little, and so I would say I probably didn't have a lot to do with it, other than the fact that I wrote the book. It was not the Immaculate Conception. A.J. Walkley, have you seen the Japanese version of Sideways? If so, do you feel it did your book justice? Yeah, I saw it, a subtitled version. I was hoping, I knew it wasn't going to be good because they have terrible censorship laws in Japan. It was nice that they had to pay me for it. It was the first time I went past page 1 of a contract, to foreign movie remake rights, which was kind of nice. But I was hoping it would be a camp classic, and I don't want to, do some pidgin Japanese here, but like Godzilla or something like that. That would be funny. I could laugh at it. But it was really very tepid and watered down, and it was terrible. A terrible film. Anyway, that's all I can say. But, the check cleared. This is from A.J. Walkley. I noticed that in Vertical, Miles has written a novel that was made into a movie, which sounds very similar to real life for you. How autobiographical are your books? Well, that's a good question. I get asked that a lot. In fact, I just got asked that yesterday. My books are very autobiographical. As I said, in Sideways, Miles is nursing the wounds of a divorce. He's written a book that has 70 rejection letters. He's up in an area where I spent a lot of time. The character of Jack is based on a very good friend of mine, Roy, who took a trip with me up there, who inspired. Actually, Sideways was originally a screenplay that didn't work, and I abandoned it, and then I started writing it as a novel. And then that first-person voice came in, and it made it even more personal in a way. So I draw a great deal. Vertical is very personal. My mother had a stroke. I had to deal with her, and that's another really long story that may come up in another question. Certainly the whole thing, where Sideways deals with failure, Vertical deals with celebrity and the perils of it. In fact, they're really just the opposite sides of the same coin, as you'll see if you read the novel. And that's what happened to me after Sideways came out. I suddenly went from being nowhere to everybody wanting something from me, everyone pouring wine at me. And Miles, you know, he's drinking a lot in this book. But I draw a great deal on personal things, but I fictionalize for comedic, dramatic effect. You know, it's not. I actually, my ex-wife, who had, you know, she won an Oscar for a short film I wrote. She actually told me when she read Sideways, she told me to burn it. She hated it, which is kind of funny. But I asked her if she'd read Vertical, and she said no. I said, why not? She said, well, just I know you so well. It's so personal. It's hard for me to read, Rex. That's what she said. So they're very autobiographical. They're very personal. Some of the events, people say, did that happen to you? Well, no, really. Did you drink from a spit bucket? Not the way it is in the book and in the movie, but yeah, one time I did actually lift up a spit bucket, you know. So I'll hyperbolize, I'll fictionalize, but at the core of it, the spine of both of these novels is really the journey of Miles, because it's written in first person from the standpoint of Miles, and it's really my journey from failure to success to the end. So really good question. You know, they say write what you know, and some people, you know, it's hard. I once said to Alexander Payne, I know I'm digressing here, I said to Alexander Payne, who always usually writes, you know, he'll adapt novels and stuff. I said, I write from the inside out and you write from the outside in. He kind of smiled at me. It's really hard to look at yourself in that way and to dredge up this very personal material and put it in fictional form. It's, you know, if it gets celebrated as it did with Sideways, although bear in mind, the novel was turned down by over 100 publishers, even after Alexander Payne optioned it, the publishing industry still turned the book down. You know, it becomes you know, it'd be one thing if you just wrote a mystery novel or, you know, a thriller or whatever and it got turned down. You wouldn't take it so personally, but when you write something so personal and it gets rejected, you really take it personal. And so it's hard. And then when it gets celebrated, as it finally did with it being a movie, then you feel tremendously validated. So yes, my work is very autobiographical. It's going to become less autobiographical because, as I said to my agent the other day, I'm tired of sucking the marrow of my own brain. I'm not sure how much is up there. It's very hard to do what I do, but I'm not the first person who's done it. So great question. This is from Chloe. What do you enjoy most about creating a new novel? What's the toughest part, the easiest? Well, Chloe, I just answered that question. You know, for me, really the easiest part are the ideas that I draw on, and the ideation, the initial process of imagining the world. There are a lot of writers I know who just write 5 pages a day and they don't know where they're going. I always know where I'm going. I always have an ending. I always tell writers this, that you should really hear the characters in your head. I've read too many screenplays, and so many of them are so bad because the characters are so, the writer is so tin-eared, the characters are so one-dimensional. It's like they've never met a cop, or they've never met, you know, write something that feels real, write something that feels, a word I use is verisimilitude, that has that, you know, that veneer of reality. So it's, let me just reread that for a second. Yeah, I mean, I think taking real characters and real settings and then getting myself into the world, that's a part that I enjoy the most. And once I build that world and I see the spine of it, then I really write very quickly. Then the hard part is showing it to people. By far and away, that's the hard part. When I showed Sideways to people, my agent loved it. The eventual producer of the movie, he just flipped for it. But my ex-wife Barbara, who I adore, who has an Academy Award on her mantle from a short film that I wrote that she made at the American Film Institute. She hated it, totally hated it. I almost burned it. She told me to burn the novel. A woman I was dating at the time, she just said, this is too personal. This is ridiculous. I hate this book. So that's the hard part, is when you give birth to something, you know, and then it's got 11 fingers or whatever. You don't know what it is, and you need validation, but you have no choice. You have to go to the world with it. And with Vertical, it's been no different. There's some scenes in there that are very personal, and some people are like, ooh, I don't know, Rex, or whatever. Or you have people in the wine world saying, God, why didn't you write about my wines? And why did you write that? Or you were wrong about this, or whatever. You know, you're going to take it from every side. So that's the hard part, going to the world. The easy part is having the ideas and having fun with it up in your imagination. Good question. This is from Megan. How does writing a screenplay differ from writing a novel? Is one harder than the other? The reason in LA there are 18 million people writing screenplays and not writing novels is because they think it's easier. Oh, it's only 120 pages. Plus, if you've looked at a screenplay, there's fewer words on it. A novel's like, you know. I liken a screenplay a little bit like skipping a stone over the water, and because you're really going from A to D to F, whatever. You don't, you know, and a novel is really like getting into the water waist deep and wading, you know, like someone on a hangover across that entire lake. You have to create the whole world. So I want to say it's harder to write a novel. It's certainly novels tend to be longer, and they take. I've never spent more than 4 months writing a screenplay, and I've written over 20 in my life. Novels they just take longer to write. I mean, I wrote the first draft of Sideways in 9 weeks, but really it was building up in me. But through various rewrites, it took longer. But to write a good screenplay is just as hard than it is to write a good novel. But to write a mediocre screenplay or a bad screenplay is really easy to do, because everybody in this city is doing it. Just go to Starbucks. There's 5 people writing screenplays at every Starbucks. So I think it's much harder to write a mediocre novel than a mediocre screenplay. It's much harder to write a bad novel than a bad screenplay. But it's just as hard to write a really good screenplay once you understand that a really good screenplay is imagining a novel and then adapting it without having written the novel, if you think of it that way. On the other hand, I'm going to be very quick to add here, when I look out at film and stuff, I'm not really seeing good screenplays necessarily being made into movies. So this is not advice for you to really, you know, write a great screenplay, because I go see a film like Bridesmaids and it just looks really silly and stupid and just is a bunch of skits strung together. So in that sense, it's probably, for them, was probably very easy to write, and it's very successful, and now we're going to see a bunch of more crap from them. Or Hangover or something. It's just, you know, it doesn't have really the emotional depth that a novel can have, or a really good screenplay have. So to write a really great screenplay is just as hard to write as it is to write a novel, but it's fewer words. You're only dealing with 120 pages. This is 405 pages of all prose. So it's a good question. Probably ultimately easier to write a screenplay. This is from Travis. What is your everyday go-to wine? What is the best glass of wine you've ever had? Well, right now these days, I'm not drinking, so I don't have a go-to wine today. But everyone in the wine world has this aha moment that turned them on to wine. And in my case, this is a little, well, it's okay. This happened so long ago, it's past the statute of limitations. When I was like 18 years old, I actually went to Europe, and when I came back, I discovered wine and European beers, and I went to a liquor store, and the guy there with a friend of mine, and he would buy a pack of cigarettes, and I wasn't old enough to buy wine, so I went over into their small wine selection, and I would put a bottle of wine under my coat, and it was, I'll never forget, it was a 1967 Beaulieu George Latour Private Reserve, and it was only like $6.50. And we went in there every week, and we opened it, and it turns out 1967 is one of the great years in the history of Napa. This is a Napa Cabernet, which is a Bordeaux-based wine, and the winemaker, George Chef or something, is a very, I didn't even know this. I was like 18, 19. I figured if I'm going to steal a bottle, I might just steal the most expensive one they had. It was basically a liquor store. It wasn't a wine store like we have today. And my friend and I would drink the bottle, and we were like blown away. What is this? This is incredible. So I guess because it was the first wine I had that was not Mateus or Blue Nun or whatever people drank back in those days on dates, that it just was mind-blowing. So that's the best wine, 67 Beaulieu, Private Reserve, George de Latour. This is from Travis also. Well, you're question happy there, aren't you? What, if anything, bothered you most about the movie adaptation of Sideways? Were there any parts of the movie that you wish would have been different or been done differently to better represent your book? Really good question, Travis. Got to be careful what I say here. The movie is an incredibly faithful adaptation of my book. You know, when you option a book, you just hope it gets made into a movie because that's where the payday is from a financial standpoint. And then when it's made, you just hope it bears any resemblance to your novel, to the sensibility of your novel. In that sense, from a movie adaptation standpoint, you know, I really summited Mount Everest because the movie was hugely successful. It was incredibly faithful to my novel, and it won over 350 awards. Are there some things about it that I don't like? I don't mind that they changed Miles and made him an 8th grade school teacher. He's a little more dyspeptic and a little slightly more pathetic in the movie than he is in the novel, I think. But then again, Miles is basically me, so maybe I'm sensitive. That didn't bother me. One thing that bothered me was Sandra Oh's character. She was married to Alexander Payne at the time, and her character in the novel, and she boasts about this on NPR, so this is not this is public knowledge here. She was a tertiary character. Maya, played by Virginia Madsen, is a secondary character. She's a tertiary character because of this. And Miles, Sideways was written in the first person from the standpoint of Miles, so I can't go narratively anywhere Miles doesn't go. In the movie, Alexander Payne had the luxury of going away from Miles, going off with Jack and with Stephanie or whatever. But he chose not to. If you watch the movie again, he stays in the first person. Miles, Paul Giamatti, is in every scene of the movie, or we walk into a scene with him. He never goes away from the first person. That's how faithful it is to my book, and he had the luxury to do it. Sandra Oh knew, as a result, because her relationship was with Jack, so we never go off with her and Jack to have a moment or a scene where she can have a speech about wine. She never had that. She knew that. She was smart enough. So what she did was she changed the accoutrement of her character, if you will. She changed her name. And Alexander, by the way, is a guy who, you know, he listens to input, but at the end of the day, he's pretty proprietary about, you know, his creative decisions. He allowed her to change her name. She changed her mode of transportation, gave her an interracial kid, which is not in the novel, and you know, all to make her kind of stand out more. I don't mind that she drives a motorcycle. That's fine. That kind of works for me. But the interracial kid, it makes Jack, you know, having an affair is bad enough, you know, as you know, days before he's going to get married. I don't endorse that behavior. It's really a cautionary tale. As some women have said, how can you have these women, you know, these guys be like this? They're such cads. They're the worst kind of, you know. I said, look, it's, you know, they get their comeuppance, but it makes him more pathetic that he has an affair with a woman who's a single mom and an interracial kid. That's not in the novel, and don't like it. And there's a scene in a bowling alley that was originally like 4 minutes long, and it's kind of a big scene for Sandra because she has her white trash mom in there and the interracial kid and Jack and Miles, and they kept cutting. It was the one scene in focus screenings that everyone said get rid of. When I read the script, I said get rid of this scene, and they kept cutting it down, and finally it was 1 minute. So it's the one scene in the movie, a movie which I love. It's done a lot for me. I wish that part was gone. And the only reason Alexander did it is because he was married to her and he probably had to listen to her. I'm sure he'll hate me for saying that, but she brags about it on NPR, and you can find that interview about how she changed all these things in her character. Paul didn't change anything. Thomas Hayden Church, who plays Jack, didn't change anything. Virginia Madsen didn't change anything, but she changed everything about her character. So I don't like that one scene. But other than that, I love the movie. This is from Gargoyle. Are you playing video games over there. You've said that you wrote Sideways in a time of desperation. If that were not the case, is there anything that you would change about it? Would you write it at all? Yeah, I did write it in a time of desperation. I was utterly destitute. In fact, I was pretty much ready to pack it up and get in my car and drive off into the sunset. I gave Hollywood my chance. I was at an age in my life where I wasn't going to go become a waiter or a barista at Starbucks. So I wrote from that place where I was at. So would I change anything? I suppose looking back, I wanted to write a book called My Life on Spec, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Process Server, and it was going to be a book about writing and becoming a writer. And one of the chapters is how low can you go and still turn on your laptop. But I didn't want to be in that place. I would have liked to have been a successful writer. Looking back, retrospectively, the very fact that I found myself in that place and then wrote from that place, I don't endorse going to that place so that you can write about it. I just found myself there and then wrote about it. So, or wrote from that place that I'd found myself and tried to find humor in it as well. I mean, that was the key thing, was finding humor. Otherwise, it could have just been a bitter, dark slog. I wouldn't want to go back there after the success of Sideways. Then I wrote from that position of success. Right now I'm writing a TV show for HBO that has nothing to do with me, and I don't know if I want to go back to writing about myself anymore. As I said to Allison here, and I said to my agents, just find me work adapting novels, and I'm tired of sucking the marrow of my own brain, my own experience. It's too hard to go there. So no, I hope never to have to go back there. Am I glad I visited that place of destitution and fleeing landlords pounding on my door and creditors and process servers? And I don't really want to revisit that place, but I guess I'm glad that I transited through there and was able to pull or alchemize a work out there that got made into a movie. And I think one of the things that made the movie so popular and so beloved, and even to this day people still remember it, is that it was written from such a personal place it felt really real. And when you see movies today, I saw a movie last night that I couldn't stand that just felt so unreal, like people had never visited this world. You really feel that the creators of this knew their world, and beginning with the novel, I did know that world. And so anyway, I hope that answered your question. I realize that was a little digressive. This is from, I'll say Garlock. How did Vertical come about? Has the story been playing on your mind since Sideways? Is this another novel written in desperate times? Well, no, it's not a novel written in desperate times, and this is a long answer. I'm going to be very brief. After Sideways came out, now everybody wanted everything from me. I had agents wanting me to write screenplays, they wanted me to do adaptations, they wanted to sell me to write TV shows, and I had a publishing agent. And of course, he wanted to do a deal for a novel, and I didn't know what my next novel was going to be. I wrote a screenplay in the early 90s called The Road Back, and it was about a young music video director whose mother has a stroke, and he's very successful. It's based on David Fincher, the director of The Social Network. His very first feature was Alien 3, and I was the last writer on Alien 3, and that's another long story. And he gets involved with his family, and through a series of circumstances, he ends up on the road to Wisconsin with his mother and with a nursemaid. Much admired screenplay, optioned, 5 years, never made. It's a banal Hollywood story. Park that. Sideways hits. It's 04, 05 now, 06. What's your next novel? He's saying. I said, I don't know. I don't have another novel in me. And he had read this screenplay. It was called The Road Back. And he said, why don't you novelize that? And I said, I don't want to rake over old bones. I don't want to go there. I wrote that script a dozen years ago, and he kept hounding me. So I did a deal with Knopf and to write it. And it was the screenplay, again, stone skipping across the pond, but a novel was a slow slog. And the first draft was very long. It was 200,000 words. And Knopf treated me very badly. They're the literary division of Random House. I thought I'd be treated well. I wasn't. They took 5 months to get back to the first draft, which is despicable. And then I was into a second draft, and I decided that I wanted to take that music video director and make him Miles, and that's when I had the idea of a sequel. It was at that moment, and so I reverse course, told my agent to tell Knopf that I was writing the sequel. They weren't happy. It's another long story. So the process started really in the early 90s with a screenplay, The Road Back, became a novel 12 years later that wasn't working for me in the writing process, and then was morphed into the Sideway sequel, and here we are with Vertical. This is also same by Gargo. You talk about your frustration with Hollywood pandering to the least common denominator, a frustration that I've shared over the years in graphic design, video game design, and motion design. How do you reconcile paying the bills while feeding the fire inside? Man. You know, it's a great question. This could be the subject of an hour-long answer, really, because you know my whole life has really been pursuing the uncompromising, trying to find my own sensibility. When I went to the University of California at San Diego, I had a great film teacher. I was watching avant-garde cinema and being turned on by the great Louis Buñuel and you know Rainer Werner Fassbinder, guys who were totally uncompromising artists, and that's what I wanted to be, or reading great literature and wanting to write that great literature. And then you get out in the real world and you find that you know being uncompromising doesn't always pay the bills, as you say. But I've really forged a life of being uncompromising, but I've had to learn a few things. I mean, I learned when I was 20 that poetry wasn't going to pay the bills, so I ditched that career. I learned trying to write like you know Samuel Beckett or Franz Kafka wasn't going to do it because people weren't reading postmodernist fiction anymore, and it was never going to get it published. So you could waste a lot of time going down that road. Not that I don't admire you know people who are trying to forge you know new frontiers in literature and film, because I've always been about breaking the rules. But for me, learning to tell stories and learning to create real characters and finding that balance between tragedy and comedy. If you can make people laugh, you can sell depression, because Miles is a depressed character, but if he were just depressed, it wouldn't work. So I guess for me, it's I want to forge my own path. I want to write the kinds of books that I would like to read, and I want to write the kind of movies or books that would become movies that I want to see. But I have a lot of young writer friends who, you know, ask me, they look up to me and ask me questions. And sometimes I'm stumped because I want them to really not write this kind of generic Hangover or, you know, action Michael Bay crap or whatever's out there right now. And yet, at the same time, that's what's getting made, you know. It's, you know, I don't know. And of course, everything is really changing with the internet. There's, you know, the way, you know, indie cinema used to be much stronger 10 years ago than it was today. It's very difficult to make an indie film and very difficult to get it released, to get it sold. Actually, it's easier to make an indie film today with digital, but it's harder to get it really released. I took a meeting recently with a script I wrote that I want to direct, and the guy, he was actually an indie producer and very successful. He said, Rex, I don't even use the word drama anymore when I go into a meeting at a studio. And I thought, God, that's sad. And he goes, yeah, that's sad. So selling out, I'm not even sure what selling out is anymore. You know, you can be exploring your own world in fiction, in screenplay form or in movie form, and you may have no audience. Is the audience getting dumber and dumber? I don't want to think so, but I sort of believe it is. So I've always been somebody, I can only tell you where I'm coming from, I've always been someone, I don't really care, for instance, what you know, what the zeitgeist of people is out there. I don't really care what people are seeing all that much. I'm aware of it. For me, it's, for instance, I wrote a mystery novel before Sideways, and it almost got published. It got me a good agent, and it was about an older detective who mentors a younger detective-to-be. And the only reason I was told it wasn't published is because 95% of all mysteries are read by women, and because it's two guys, that's what I was told by publishers. It was well written, it was all this. Had I researched mysteries and who the audience was, I probably never would have written it. So I don't do, I don't do that. I don't read books on how to write screenplays. I don't read books on what the market is. I mean, look, if you want to make money right now and you want to write fiction, write young adult vampire crap. That's probably, or fantasy. I'm sure they're all looking for the next Harry Potter, and if you can do it, God bless you, and you'll live, I have a saying, I made it up. There's a friend of mine who wanted to be a novelist and write great books that would be remembered. But he ended up writing for TV, and he's made millions of dollars, but no one's ever going to remember him. And at that time, he's saying, well, I'm taking this TV job because, pay the bills, but I really want to write my Crime and Punishment. I said, what you're doing is what you're becoming, and what you've done is what you've become. And that's it. You make that choice, and you want to write commercial stuff and have it be both commercial and be, artistically successful and something that endures. Well, I lucked out with Sideways. I mean, that movie really does endure. People still remember it to this day, but I'm not advising anyone to go down the road I went down to achieve that, and nor was that necessarily my goal. Just who I am as an artist and as a writer. So I really don't know the answer, to that. This is from Bad Camera. Do you have any plans to direct again now that you've written the Sideways sequel? Perhaps the time is right for From Hollywood to Deadwood 2. Well, I wouldn't do From Hollywood to Deadwood 2 since that film bombed, although it was a script that got me my first agent and it got me my first writing job with Kevin Bacon. But we were undercapitalized and it was a very difficult film. We did sell it, it did get released, but the company Island Pictures released it, they butchered it, and it was a long 4 years of my life and ended badly. I would love to direct again. I wrote a screenplay called Repairman. It's a little indie $3 million feature, and I guess I don't want to become the next hot indie filmmaker because I'm probably too old for that, but I really want to direct one film in the digital day because I made both my films in the analog day, and each film took me 4 years to make. My first film, I had no assistant editors. I was cutting film and sound. I mean, all you people probably watching this are too young to know what it was like. 95% of what I did in post-production, you don't even do today at all. It's just so much faster in digital. The equipment is so much lighter. The lighting package, everything is just. I just want to make a film in the digital days. So yes, the answer is Repairman. I want to make it. If someone gives me $3 million, I don't want to make a film. My first feature, California Without End, was a road movie, shot in analog, started in San Francisco, ended in Baja, California. It was a 1,000-mile road movie, and we did it for 60 grand and 16 millimeter. Never had a permit, never had a cop, never had a fire marshal. Stole every location, and it's a 2-hour feature. It was sold to German TV. It's kind of a bleak film. But that one took 4 years to make, and it was really, really, really brutal. So yeah, I'd like to just make one last film in the digital day, but not From Hollywood to Deadwood 2. Also from Bad Camera, any advice for writers with rejected manuscripts? If the internet is to be believed, Sideways was rejected by 15 different publishers. What made you keep trying after the first, 10 rejections? Sideways was rejected by over 100 publishers on 3 separate submissions. Initially went out, my agents were very excited about it. It went out to both film, went to film companies, and we went to publishing houses. The publishing world hated the novel so much that my agent pulled it after 15 or 16 rejections. So maybe that's where you read it. He pulled it and wanted me to rewrite it, but he didn't have really any input from me. The film world didn't want it. It was a full, long year before Alexander Payne ever read it, and that's a long story how the book even got to him, which maybe I'll tell in one of these other questions, because it's really a fascinating story. Actually, we just came out with the Sideways hardcover, which it came out as a trade paperback from St. Martin's, and I wrote a long 13,000 word forward to it, and it really describes everything. So if you want to buy a copy of the hardcover and read the forward, maybe I'll answer it a little bit. It's kind of a long story. After Alexander Payne did read it, he optioned the novel. My publisher went out again. Oh my God, it was front page trade news that Artisan Entertainment on both Daily Variety and Hollywood Reporter was Alexander Payne Goes Sideways. He was very hot after Election, his second feature. We went back out to the publishing world with it and was still rejected by over 20 publishers. Then Alexander Payne decided he was going to make another movie about Schmidt. but he kept optioning the novel, and my agent kept pressuring me to rewrite it, but he had no input or whatever, and I was growing despondent. After About Schmidt, Alexander came back to Sideways. I changed publishing agents. We went back out, and it was rejected by another 20 publishers, probably some of the same, probably with different senior editors, and we ended up selling it at a fire sale for $5,000 to St. Martin's Press. I wish I hadn't done that, because when the movie came out, if it was an unpublished novel, when that movie came out, the reviews was such a huge hit. I've been told it would have sold for $1 million. I sold it for $5,000. St. Martin's, even given the fact that it was a success, they did nothing for that novel when it came out. Nothing. It should have been in every tasting room on the Pacific Coast. My God, it was a huge phenomenon in the wine world. They did nothing. And I had no motivation to do anything because I was only making a 70 cents a book royalty. That's all I was making. I have nothing but contempt for the traditional publishing world, nothing but contempt for them. And I don't mind saying that. They left hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table. I wish I'd never sold it to them. I wish I'd self-published it. I would have made way more money. You know, I didn't write for money, but at that point, suddenly everyone starts talking about money. So maybe I got off the question there, but writers, any advice for writers with rejected manuscripts? You know, you can try to go to the self-publishing route. The problem is you have to have capitalization and you have to have branding. And this book was self-published. I took it away from Knopf when they were not enthusiastic about me abandoning one novel and doing a sequel. And now I have control. I have a website, a whole social media. The traditional publishers are really locked in the 20th century. They don't really have the infrastructure of the 21st century, and you're going to see more and more self-imprints in people, but you've got to have branding, otherwise only your family members are going to buy it. You know, I guess you just, you know, my advice is really to write another book, write another screenplay. Too many people put all their eggs in that one basket, and they keep pushing it or they keep rewriting it, and maybe that's a way to go. I think you should move on from it and leave it there. They may come back to it if you hit it with the next one, but you know, you may think you've written, you know, The Great Gatsby, but maybe you have. There are examples. The guy who won the Pulitzer Prize in '09 for fiction, it was a book called Tinkers. I forget the author's name. He had an agent, went out, was rejected by over 70 publishers. He parked it on his hard drive. He goes, well, that's it. Must not be any good. And a friend of his had read it and liked it, and it had a kind of a medical theme. And he knew about a medical press that occasionally published some fiction. And so they were looking for manuscripts, and mostly they published nonfiction of medical nature or whatever, and they read it and they liked it. I guess it was about a guy's dad who has Alzheimer's or whatever. They published it. It's in only 2,500 copies, maybe only 1,500 copies. And they had somebody at Powell's Book in Oregon loved it and started getting it in book clubs, and it started spreading around. Well, he ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, a book that was rejected by every publisher. In fact, he abandoned the book. He just figured it was no good. So don't take my rejection is my middle name. Just don't take it personally. Just keep moving forward. Like I said, my ex-wife, who I adore, who has an Oscar based on a script I wrote for a short film. She told me to burn Sideways, and I almost did. She thought it was the worst thing she'd ever read. So stick to your guns and write the next book. And you know, everybody has dealt with rejection, even the most successful writers. If you could have casted anyone besides Paul Giamatti, who I absolutely love, to play Miles, who would you have chosen and why? Well, there were a lot of people who wanted to play Miles. There was Sean Penn. There was Ed Norton. A lot of people were circling it because Alexander Payne, now he's done Election and About Schmidt. You know, he's a hot director, and they know his film is going to get made, whatever it's going to be. And Paul Giamatti was unknown, and American Splendor was the first film he had done where he played Harvey Pekar, the kind of dyspeptic, depressed comic cartoonist or whatever. But Alexander had seen that movie, so he went with somebody who, I think, one of the things, I wouldn't have casted anybody else, and I'll tell you why, is because there was something fresh about seeing a character who wasn't like, oh, let's get, George Clooney wanted to play Jack, literally. and Alexander Payne met with him, and as the story goes, Alexander said to George, great actor, but who's going to believe you as an out-of-work actor? And George laughed and said yes, although George Clooney's in Alexander Payne's new movie, The Descendants, coming out in November. So he went with a cast that was really kind of unknown, and I don't think now retrospectively, I wouldn't have casted anybody else. I thought it was great casting. Virginia Madsen, who was kind of billed as a star in the late 80s and the next Marilyn Monroe but didn't make it, was on the scrap heap when he cast her. So there was something kind of a little bit, there's a kind of a worn beauty to her in a way, a kind of a tarnished beauty that really works. Sandra Oh got the role because she was married to Alexander. I'm sorry, but that's just the fact, you know, because I've never seen an Asian as a tasting room manager, so it's casting against type in a major way. Nothing against Asians, but no, Paul, you know, I mean, if you look at Sideways, and this might sound a little arrogant, I'm probably going to get bashed for this, but really the three people who are really irreplaceable were the guy who created the world, yours truly, Alexander Payne, the great maestro, and Paul Giamatti, the face of Miles. I think you could have brought other people in other capacities, and I think it still would have been great, but I think, you know, those three are irreplaceable, and Paul was genius in it. Miles quotes Bukowski when he finds out that his book won't be published. Who is your favorite poet? Well, I actually read this question yesterday. I had to think about it because when I first started writing, I wrote poetry. I wrote a lot of poetry, and one day, and I actually self-published 2 books of poetry and passed them around to friends. And then one day I took 2,000 pages of poetry. They're all written on a typewriter, and I walked over to the garbage can and dropped 2,000 pages of poetry, and I stopped, you know. I was one of the early readers of Bukowski. I started reading him when he wrote a column called Notes of a Dirty Old Man for the LA Free Press, which is now the LA Weekly, for those of you too young to remember that. And I remember I did a special studies major at the University of California, San Diego, specializing in contemporary literary and film criticism and creative writing. And I would go to professors and say, okay, this quarter I'm reading everything Franz Kafka wrote. I'll see you at the end of the quarter with a paper. And I went to one professor, and they always said, okay, fine, great, whatever. It was very liberal back then. And I basically created my own major. It was an autodidact major, essentially. And I went to a professor and I said, I'm going to read everything Bukowski has written, because he was still writing, obviously, at that time. This was in the late 70s. And he said, are you kidding me? He's a gutter snipe. No, the answer is no. Come back to me with somebody else. They literally would not. And we were reading a lot of postmodernists like Alain Robbe-Grillet and this French fiction that was deconstructing everything, you know. And all those people are passé now, most of them, those John Barth, and nobody reads them anymore. And Bukowski has lived. And really, what people, I mean, yeah, sure, he was a drunk and he lived in Skid Row, but there was something very real about Bukowski. And a lot of people don't, you know, at the time though, he would do big readings. I actually tried to get him to do a poetry reading at UCSD, and he agreed, and the faculty turned him down. They wouldn't let him come down. I couldn't believe it. But he would, you know, he'd get drunk and he would bait the crowd. He was very much a sexist. Feminism was pretty big at that time, and they really railed against Bukowski. And he really was a sexist. He was a misogynist in many ways. But he was also a really good writer, and he was actually a very fine poet. People don't realize it. I don't read poetry right now. So who's my favorite poet? You know what? I want to say, you know, Rimbaud. You know, A Season in Hell, which is really kind of prose poem, or The Drunken Boat. I mean, that would like rocked my world when I read. I read a lot of poetry when I was 17, 18, 19, 20, and then I just stopped really reading because I was really more into stories. I would definitely, if you haven't read Season in Hell, which was written in the 1800s, you know, certainly read that. Rainer Maria Rilke, a great German poet. There's something, you know, there's such a love of words. And along those lines, I've forgiven my ex-wife for telling me to burn Sideways. And I talked to her. She teaches at NYU, and she has an Oscar for directing a short film. And she has a short story that was written in the 80s, and it's called On Tour with Max. And it's about an older drunken poet and his young PhD candidate minder who go on the road and do a poetry reading tour of these second-tier colleges in Texas, of all places. And it's very funny. It's only a 9-page short story, and she wants to turn it into a feature film, and of course I would write it. And I said, I don't want to go to Texas, and it shouldn't be a poet. Nobody reads poetry. But then I stopped, and I thought, you know, it should be a poet, because if novels are becoming superannuated, and I was talking about this with Allison and the technician here, Mike, you know, people just aren't reading even fiction that much anymore. They're clearly not reading poetry at all. You'd have to be working in the university to be writing poetry, or just absolutely insane. But I thought, you know what, poetry is that kind of pure expression, and it's that almost that eloquent use of words in their purest forms, and that's what poetry is. And so I thought, no, he should be. So I may be actually doing a movie, writing this movie about a poet and his young PhD minder. But you know, there were, you know, I would say, you know, poetry can really turn you on. Certainly. Oh, let me not forget great Allen Ginsberg. I mean, you know, how that book, I mean, here's something interesting for you. I mean, today you write about a book of poetry, you'd be lucky to have a small press publish it and 1,000 people read it. Even if you won a Pulitzer Prize, you'd probably be lucky. Hal probably has sold in excess of 5 or 10 million copies. I mean, back in the 60s, people read poetry. Jack Kerouac, for instance, wrote a ton of poetry. People think of him as having written On the Road and Dharma Bums and whatever. No, he wrote a lot of poetry. And so all those beat poets like Ferlinghetti, I was very much into them at that time because there was something so revolutionary about what they were doing. There was something inspiring that they took chances. They didn't hold anything back. I hope that answers your question. But I don't really read poetry today, honestly. I'm sorry. This is from Miss Chrissy Lynn. Being much influenced by California wines, just how many trips have you taken through California's wine country? What's your favorite vineyard? Well, as I said earlier, I started going up to the San Ynez Valley and to play golf and get away from the travails and tribulations of my life. And so I started visiting a lot of the wineries up there, and I've taken many trips up to the San Ynez Valley, many trips, fewer to Napa Sonoma, some to the Willamette Valley, which is in Oregon and which is where Vertical goes to. I get a lot of requests to come to various wine regions in France, Spain, Australia because of Sideways. I don't like to fly, so I tend not to go. I'm not imbibing these days, so I turn them down. But I probably have spent most of my time where Sideways took place, was in the San Ynez Valley. My favorite vineyard, you probably mean your favorite winery, but that's okay. You know, up there, I don't know, I love Foxen. They have this little shed. It's actually the scene where Jack and Miles meet Stephanie. Her name is Tara in the novel. You know, you'll see it in the play, by the way. Her name is Tara. It's not Stephanie when we do the play of Sideways. And it's in this tool shed, this shack off a road. It's just such a great little tasting room. But Foxen Winery up in the San Ynez Valley is actually my favorite winery. This is from Chad. Is it intimidating when you sit down to write a sequel to such a successful book? That's a really good question. I mean, on one hand, yeah, when I wrote Sideways, I couldn't get arrested. I was nowhere. I was dead broke. So I had nobody looking over my shoulder at all. No one. When I wrote Vertical, I felt like thousands of eyes were looking over me. And, you know, obviously, the wine world would like, Miles has now become the embodiment for wine appreciation, so they would like to be perceived in a certain way. And in Vertical, he really starts out, I'll be honest with you, he starts out, he's pretty heavy into drinking. And some people, their feathers have been ruffled, but there have been people in the wine industry who've said, Rex, you're very courageous to show what is a dirty secret in the wine world, which is heavy-duty drinking. I don't like the word alcoholism, but just trust me, it's pretty pandemic in that world. So it's intimidating from the sense that I know that people would like, I mean, for instance, take Sideways. I'm digressing here. Example, when they started to make the movie, they started doing pre-production, and 2 weeks before they were going to shoot, there were 200 people up in the San Ynez Valley. And Frank Ostini, who is the owner of the Hitching Post, now a multimillionaire because of the movie, you can't get into that location, he got a hold of the screenplay. They were only showing just the scenes where they wanted, and he called an emergency session of the Santa Barbara County Vintners Association, and he said, we have to stop the production of this movie. This is not good for our image or anything. He went on a rant, and it caused a lot of problems, and they finally talked him out of the tree. They paid people off for locations. He didn't want them to shoot at the Hitchcock. 2 weeks before beginning principal photography on a $16.5 million movie, this guy was causing a major, major problem. Why? Because look, Miles drinks too much, and but when the movie came out, oh my God, the wine industry, they are so hypocritical, it's unbelievable. They just embraced the film, they were everywhere, they made so much money off of it, and so naturally they would like Miles to be an abstemious drinker, they would like him maybe not to be so flawed, so those are the pressures you face with a sequel, are the preconceptions of it, and my feeling was, and this was the liberating thing, is when I started to write, I was aware that, for instance, the International Pinot Noir celebration, they're all going to this big 3-day Bacchanal up in Oregon. I know for a fact that it's a Bacchanal. I know for a fact that there's heavy drinking there, and people are just cutting loose, and they're fornicating like mad. And I describe it like that. Oh, but when the International Pinot Noir celebration, people read the book, oh, and I even got a letter the other day threatening some legal stuff. They don't know what they're talking about. And it's like, my feeling when I started to write the book, and pardon my French here, is fuck you. Fuck all of you. I'm going to write the book I want to write, and you as a writer, if you think about that, oh, I'm going to offend this person, if I write a scene here, it's a little graphic sexually or whatever, and that's going to offend these little old ladies in, I don't know, Alabama or whatever, I don't care. I have to write what I want to write, which feels right to me, and in fact, the truth is the people who've been to, we call it the IPNC, the International Pinot Noir Celebration, they say, gosh, if anything, Rex, it was a little bit mild. But other people, oh no, they would like to have been depicted as something very decorous, and everyone has fun, and they all keep within their limits. Bullshit, so tired of the hypocrisy, tired of all that. When I wrote Sideways, I had no pressure. If I thought about the pressures, if I got 100 Sideways fans together, what would you like to see? Oh, Miles is probably with Maya, and they're happily married. They'd probably like to see that. I'm not writing, to appeal to focus groups. I'm not writing to appeal to the low common denominator of what people. Miles is now a happy guy. He's not quite so depressed and dyspeptic. Well, the truth of the matter is, a celebrity doesn't necessarily make you happy. It doesn't make you any more happy than failure does. I have to write what I feel, what I'm going through, and I could care less. And once I've always been like that, as you can now probably tell, then the shackles are off. I would write anything I want. I still then have to endure going out with it, and with Sideways, it was rejected by a lot of people. With Vertical, it wasn't going to be universally rejected. It was going to be read, which it has been. But I was going to have to hear about, oh God, that sex scene there, that's kind of graphic, Rex. How did you go there? Oh my God, Miles, she's drinking a lot here or whatever. What's on? But if you read it, you'll realize that when you get all the way to the end, the last 100 pages of this novel really changes, and there's a whole design to the debauchery of the first 250 pages. There's a whole design to it, and I don't want to give it away, and because it's. So yeah, there is pressure, but if you feel it, then you shouldn't write the sequel, because you are going to be writing with handcuffs on. Did you have a passion for wine before writing Sideways, and did you write the book intending to share some of your knowledge? No, not really. I was very lonely in the 90s, and I lived here in Santa Monica, where we're taping this, and there was a little wine shop about a mile away from where I lived, and on Saturday they had tastings from 3 to 5 for $4, and it was in a little cordoned off area, and it was my only social outlet. For $4 I could drink, and I got to know the owner's main employee, a guy named Julian, very knowledgeable about wine, and the people in this little area were very knowledgeable about wine, and they would put you down, and they were complete wine snobs. And in fact, if you read the novel Sideways, it opens in this little place called Epicurus. And in fact, going back, Sideways, I wrote it originally as a screenplay, and it didn't open at Epicurus. And it didn't work for me as a screenplay. In fact, it so didn't work, I didn't even show it to my agent. I just parked and said, well, that didn't work. I started to write a short story about a wine tasting up at this place, Epicurus, and where I started to learn a little bit about wine. And it was just a short story, and it was written in first person from the standpoint of Miles. The screenplay was not written in first person. All screenplays are in third person. You know, it was written in first person from the standpoint of Miles, and he goes to a tasting, and it kind of degenerates into a brawl, and it's funny. This is where I fictionalize and take the autobiographical to the non-autobiographical, to the fictitious. And I got to the end of the short story, and I literally stood up from my desk. I said, "Holy shit! That's the prologue to Sideways, to the novel." Jack comes in and rescues them, and then they take off and drive off because the script didn't start that way. They just took off and drove up there. And from that point on, I wrote it 9 weeks. I learned a lot about wine at Epicurus from Julian Davies, a great guy. After the owner would leave, right about, he'd always leave around 4:30, and the wine tasting would go on. They never took inventory there, so he started popping bottles and more expensive bottles, and we had some pretty crazy nights there. I did not write the novel to share my knowledge of wine, to lord it over. In fact, one thing that people in the wine world really respect about both Vertical, which has a lot to do with Willamette Valley, Oregon Pinots, and the San Ynez Valley wines, is that Miles is not really, in the novel, maybe a little bit more in the movie, but not in the novel. He's not a snob in the way that wine snobs are, because wine snobbery is not really based on, it's not democratic. For instance, say literary snobbery, we all can probably afford to buy War and Peace or Cervantes' Don Quixote, and we can lord that knowledge over you. But with wine, you can only lord your knowledge of having imbibed great Burgundies because you had the $1,000 to afford to buy those great Burgundies, and they'll play that game with you. So in other words, that wallet buys you. It's something I'm really contemptuous of, are people who are filthy rich and buy these incredibly expensive wines, and then, have you had the 94 Williams Sellium Olivet Lane, We know you can't get that wine. We know they play that game with you. And in fact, if you read the novel Sideways, Miles really makes fun of those wine snobs. So no, I didn't want to, I do know a lot about wine. I probably know more about wine not from drinking, because I didn't have the wallet to experience the wines they had, but really from reading. The Oxford Companion Wine by Jancis Robinson is really, it's an encyclopedia. You don't read it from beginning to end. It is the encyclopedia of wine, and I learned probably more from reading. I found that winemaking, the passion for Pinot Noir, which is only 1% of the world's grape varieties, it's a very difficult wine to grow, a grape to grow, and a wine to vinify. And I found it to be somewhat analogous to art, the care that you take with it, and now I'm starting to sound like Miles here, but the care you take with it, there was something there that metaphorically to me paralleled writing and trying to be an artist, that you try to be honest to the grape, you try to be honest to what the vintage that year gave you, and as a result, you produce the best you can, and then you put it out there and you hope for the best. So I saw wine as kind of a metaphor. I mean, not consciously, but kind of unconsciously. But no, I never thought of lording my wine knowledge, because really there are many more people who know way more about wine than I do. And I do love wine, or I did. But it's not my greatest passion in the world. How long did it take you to write Vertical? By Richard. Richard, I think I may have answered this question in previous answers. I mean, when people ask me how long did it take you to write Sideways, I say 10 years, because it really started in 1990 when I went up to the San Ynez Valley, and I wasn't writing Sideways. I just was going up there to play golf and hang out. It was a cheap vacation and getaway for me, and my life was terrible shit. And then I wrote a mystery novel, so I threw that in. So it took me 9 weeks to write the first draft, but really it took me 10 years because it was building and building inside me. Vertical started with a screenplay, as I said, that I wrote in 1992, and was optioned for 5 years, and it was rewritten and whatever, parked, and then I did a deal with Alfred Knopf, the literary division of Random House, to novelize it. That went on for a number of years. I abandoned it and morphed it. So in some ways, I would say 18 years to write Vertical. And if you were to go back, because there are still scenes from that screenplay I wrote in 1992 that are currently in Vertical, it's been a long haul. It's really, It's probably the apotheosis of my writing career. People ask me, what's your next novel, even though this novel ends with he might be going, Miles might be going here, But I don't know. I don't think I would write another novel. I'm not sure people really read that much anymore. And so, in a way, Sideways was a chunk of my life put into this comic novel. It was made into a great film. Vertical is really, it's a bigger novel. It's emotionally richer in some ways. People who read it, some say it's better than Sideways. I don't know. I'll leave that up to other people. I don't know if I have any more of myself to give in a novel. I'm kind of enjoying writing a pilot for HBO right now that does deal with the wine world, and it's only 35 pages, 35 screenplay pages. That's all they want. So I go, oh wow, that's easy. It's like writing one poem. But not really. It's not easy. It's there's a lot involved in it, and it's actually been a year in the making just to write this 35 pages. But it's a different form. I'm having fun with it. I know I've kind of gotten off track there, but yeah, Vertical was a lot of my life, and I think I have to live more to write the next one. Marie Rose wants to know what's the best wine to serve with tuna salad. Well, that's the question you ask Gary Vaynerchuk, who does a wine webisode that's really funny. He's a great guy. I'm not big, when I was drinking, I'm not really big into food and wine pairing. And in fact, if you have a really great wine, most people in the wine world will say, don't pair it with any food. There are some standard pairing things, certain whites with white fish and red meats, whatever, but you can have a big Chardonnay with a steak and it would work. There are people who are pretty nutty about pairing. As far as tuna fish, I think that's going to probably blow any wine out of the water. So I would say the cheapest wine you could possibly have, you would probably want something very acidic to cut across the saltiness of the tuna. I don't know, try maybe a really dry Cabernet Riesling. How's that? Mike wanted to know what my best round of golf had. Spurred by probably having read on the internet that the scene in the movie where Miles hits the ball back at the group that hit into him and he hits their golf cart. Well, I actually hit that shot. If you know anything about golf and you looked at Paul Giamatti's swing, he probably would have whiffed the ball. I actually hit the cart on the third take, so it was a pretty easy shot for me. But the best round of golf, I started when I was 8 years old, and I played a lot of golf. We were members, our family, of kind of a middle-class country club down in San Diego. And when I was 12 years old, I was playing in the 13 and 14 division because I was a good golfer and I wanted to play the longer courses. And on my home course, when I was 12 years old, I shot 3 over 75 and won the 13-14 division. When I was 14, I quit golf and didn't pick up a club for 15 years, just totally quit. I was headed to the PGA Tour. I was the second-ranked junior in all of San Diego County when I was 12 or 13 years old, but I left it for surfing, and I just didn't, it's kind of, we go back to one of the very first questions about what's your other passion. For me, and I said, well, it's writing, because if you're going to be good at something, you have to give it 150%, and I just couldn't give golf 150% anymore. You just have to hit balls and hit balls if you want to be at that level every day and until you're brain dead. I got into surfing. That was my passion. I built boards and whatever, and then at age 18, forget that. I'm not surfing anymore. Literally, I was in San Diego. I lived 3 blocks from the beach. I didn't even go to the beach. Again, not even on the hottest days, because all I did was read books and watch movies, read books, watch movies. So I did get back into golf. I'm very intense, and I always I want to be the best I can be at anything, and I think you have to give it all, and so I try to get back into it. At La Prisma, my favorite golf course in the San Ynez Valley. If you ever go up there and you want to visit the hitching post and all these great, and you play golf, go to La Prisma, because during midweek there's nobody on it. It's a very difficult golf course. The wind really blows. They've actually played PGA Tour final qualifying there, and I shot 75 there one day from the back tees, which is also my second best round. And then I had another great round, but it's kind of a longer story. But that round when I was 12, and I won the 13-14 division, and I'm on a perpetual trophy, my name etched on the trophy, with the great Phil Mickelson, who's also on that trophy. He grew up on the same country club I did. Of course, his name's on there 3 times. That was my finest moment, 12 years old. Taylor wants to know, would I rather win a Pulitzer or an Oscar? I have such contempt for the publishing world. Not the Pulitzer people or whatever, but such contempt for the publishing world. I'd rather win an Oscar for either best adaptation of Vertical, which I did. I adapted Vertical. That would be with a friend of mine, a young writer, Pamela Smith, and I'd love nothing more than 3 years from now that this got made. And Sideways was nominated for 5 Oscars. It won the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay, did not win for Best Picture. It won Best Picture almost every other critics award, but we got beat out by Million Dollar Baby. It was kind of, Alexander's joke was we had too many F words in there, otherwise we might have won. But Alexander Payne, his writing partner, they won the Oscar. They don't give it to the novelist. They give it to the adapters. I consider that to be a slight. My ex-wife has an Oscar for the best live-action short, and there she was up in front of millions of people, and Cate Blanchett and Jude Law handing the Oscar in 2000. I wrote it. I even wrote her Oscar speech. But they didn't give it to the writer. They gave it to the director. And at that time, they also gave it to the producer. You win an Oscar for best adapted screenplay. It's given to the adapters. It's not given to the guy who wrote the source material. So twice I've been that close. I'm really behind 2 Academy Awards, 2 Oscars. So the Oscar would mean more to me, just the same way that the Writers Guild recently voted the 101 greatest screenplays of all time. It's a flawed list. It's a flawed list. But Sideways is on that list, and they memorialized it in the Writers Guild Theater in Beverly Hills with plaques, and my name is on that plaque. And that means more to me than the money and all the other stuff. So I'd rather win the Oscar, because I really consider myself as having come from film and filmmaking. I love literature. I love novels, but my greatest love is movies. And to have gotten that, I mean, I wouldn't say I got that close. I am behind 2 Academy Awards, 2 Oscars, so I will always have that. And Sideways will always be on that Oscar, as will My Mother Dreams, The Satan's Disciples in New York, the short film I wrote, will always be on there. But it'd be nice to see my name on that 8.5-pound statuette, which I occasionally get from my ex-wife custody rights to and go out. It's a great way to get a free glass of wine at a bar, I'll tell you. Vertical is on every, it's on Amazon, it's Barnes & Noble, it's all ebook, Kindle. It's available widely. Obviously, people don't buy in bookstores anymore, so as a self-imprint, we've chosen not to go that route. It will soon be available probably in every, not every tasting room, but many tasting rooms, wherever there's kind of a wine-related thing. But yeah, right now, it's, the greatest bookstore in the world. I used to go to small bookstores my whole life, sometimes twice a day. That's where I discovered books. But the greatest bookstore in the world is Amazon. I mean, if you know an author and you're looking for someone and it's out of print, you can find it from a third-party seller. So I go to Amazon, it's discounted $10, $20. We have come out with a boxed edition. It's just come out, and it will be, also you can go to my website, verticalthenovel.com. I also blog there, so you might enjoy reading about the travails of me. I write all kinds of personal stuff on there. And so you can find it there. But we've come out with a boxed edition of Sideways with a new foreword that I wrote, and Vertical, both in hardcover. It's kind of like a gift thing. So that will also be available on my website, or loosegravelpress.com, which is the name of my company. And but yeah, it's pretty widely available.